Are you a part of the majority of people that, for whatever reason, you don't like Paul Castellano? Watch this video, it might change your mind. Or at least we can have a conversation about it in the comments section below. And as always, please like and subscribe. There seems to be one general consensus that former boss of the Gambino family, Paul Castellano, was not a real gangster, and therefore this made him unworthy of being a boss.
Paul Castellano wasn't a real gangster. Paul was a businessman.
In this video, we will attempt to litigate all the major accusations against Paul and counter all arguments that he was not a real gangster and render all accusations against him invalid and without merit. First, on its surface, by any and all definition, Paul was a made member of La Cosa Nostra. This in fact certifies him as a full-fledged, bona fide gangster. In order to be fully inducted, one must pass several requirements. Although these requirements may vary, the underlying qualifications directly reflect one's ability to conduct themselves as gangsters and carry out actions that an average gangster would be expected to carry out. This alone invalidates the audacity of the original argument that Paul Castellano was not a true gangster. At a relatively young age, Paul achieved the rank of captain within the crime family, which at the time was still the Mangano family and under the administration of Albert Anastasia. So Paul's accomplishments predate his cousin Carlo Gambino's reign as boss, making any accusations of nepotism invalid. More so, Albert Anastasia, known as the Lord High Executioner, was one of the most feared and ruthless bosses to ever be head of a family. For Paul to achieve captain status under Anastasia, he would have been tried, tested, and hardened. One of Paul's most underappreciated attributes is his commitment to omerta, the law of silence. For all intents and purposes, Paul was a stand-up guy. After his first arrest as a teenager, robbing a convenience store along with 2 cohorts, Paul did not cooperate with law enforcement, not identifying the other men who were with him, and ultimately doing time for the robbery himself.
During interrogation, Castellano claimed the other 2 men were hitchhikers and he didn't know their names. Big Paul took the fall alone and was sent to the slammer for a year.
He went off to prison uncomplainingly, got out after 3 months, and discovered he was suddenly a hero in the neighborhood.
Local mob leaders praised Castellano for not ratting on his friends.
Later in life, he maintained the law of silence after his subsequent arrest at the Appalachian meeting of 1957.
Castellano was brought before a grand jury to testify about the mobsters' conference in Appalachian. But he claimed that he was simply there to visit a friend to talk about a heart condition.
Castellano refused to cooperate, refused to testify before a grand jury, and earned the respect of other gangsters.
Then in 1985, Paul, along with the other bosses of the New York families, were indicted in the famous commission case. Again, Paul maintained his silence. From his beginning to his end, he never cooperated, he never ratted.
On February 25, 1985, Paul was arrested along with the bosses of New York's other crime families in what became known as the commission case. The bosses, who all sat on the mob's board of directors or commission, were charged with racketeering in connection with shaking down New York building contractors and demanding a 2% tax on big cement jobs.
These actions alone earns Paul more gangster merits than most of the so-called real gangsters that everyone is quick to praise over Paul Castellano. His ability to do the crime, do the time, not become a rat, and not cooperate with the government over the course of his life into his 60s is more than can be said for many others who folded. All these so-called gangsters who ended up breaking omerta, becoming government informants. And nowadays they are authors, podcasters, YouTube creators, and probably worst of all, social media influencers. They all seem to have forgotten that this is a secret organization.
You're turning this thing of ours into entertainment for every chidrula that watches the 6 o'clock news. But our thing is secret. Kabish? Secret. And what you're doing won't work.
Another argument is that Paul Castellano never got his hands dirty.
He wasn't a button man, he didn't kill anybody. And so what does he know? You know, he's never been a loan shark, and so what does he know?
He was the mob's version of Little Lord Fauntleroy. I mean, you know, he came all dressed up neat and clean. He didn't have to get his hands dirty or bloody. And this empire was then given to him, given unto him as this great gift, where guys who had been in the trenches, robbing and stealing and killing and hijacking and everything, you know, for years said, hey, what about me?
First of all, there is no evidence that proves he did not get his hands dirty. As mentioned earlier, he executed an armed robbery as a teenager and suffered several prison sentences throughout his life and career. And again, referring back to Paul's rise under Albert Anastasia, you can't be a captain under Albert without dirty hands. Also, there are many made members of La Cosa Nostra who in fact make their way up in the ranks of the family by using little to no violence. Whether or not Paul got his hands dirty is irrelevant and immaterial. Paul Castellano knew how to make money, especially clean money, and that's the best kind. This made him invaluable to Albert Anastasia, then later to his cousin Carlo, when he assumed leadership and renamed the family into the Gambino family. It was then that Carlo decided to usher the family into more legitimate operations in order to multiply their money and power. Due to his already established foothold in the legitimate sector, Paul was instrumental in advising Carlo during this transition, from Side Street to Wall Street.
By the early 50s, he owned a lucrative wholesale meat company. By all outward appearances, he was an upstanding businessman, dressing well and driving a sleek Buick convertible. But out of the office, Paul stayed close to his cousin Carlo and earned his trust. He was a key player in the boss's plan to diversify the mafia and develop the so-called white rackets: construction bid rigging, union infiltration, and political corruption.
Paul's ability to make money ultimately benefited La Cosa Nostra as a whole, when he, along with Tony Salerno of the Genovese family and Tony Corallo of the Lucchese family, formed the Concrete Club, which controlled every square foot of concrete poured in the entire city of New York. This next point is somewhat subjective, but take into consideration the wisdom of Carlo Gambino. It is contradictory that people praise Carlo Gambino for his decisions, yet they reject Carlo's decision about choosing Paul as his successor.
Carlo very much wanted somebody like himself, a criminal capitalist, who subscribed to his theory of taking illegitimate profits and plowing them into legitimate operations.
Bloodlines were still paramount to Carlo, so he chose his 61-year-old first cousin and brother-in-law, Paul Castellano.
It is clear that Carlo Gambino's decision was not taken lightly and not made on a whim. Carlo is further supported by those around him. In this scene from the HBO movie Gotti, which Neil Della Croce is lecturing John Gotti, Della Croce stands by Carlo's decision.
He don't understand the street. He wants to be some butter-ass businessman. Come on, that's not Cosa Nostra.
Maybe a street guy is not what is needed. Maybe times are changing, John.
Now, whether or not this is an actual quote by Della Croce or dramatized fictional dialogue, it is a fact that the modern La Cosa Nostra, since its founding by Charles Lucky Luciano, was meant to be a business, adapting corporate models in its operations. This is precisely what Paul Castellano excelled at doing.
He thought of the Gambino crime family as a corporate entity with various investments, and he had numerous legitimate businesses that he could front, that were his cover, that were his way to respect in private industry as well as in organized crime.
Principles of honor and tradition aside, the main goal of La Cosa Nostra is to ultimately make money. Because like everything else in life, money makes everything possible. But money is especially crucial to the survival of La Cosa Nostra. Money is needed for loan sharking and for gambling wins. It's also needed for paying off law enforcement or for bribing politicians. This reliance on money to keep the criminal enterprise operational further supports Gambino's decision to elect a more business-oriented successor, hence Paul Castellano.
Big Paulie, as he was known, was more a businessman than a street mobster.
You're trying to turn this thing of ours into AT&T, and it's not. We are what we are, Paul. You got to understand that. It's all confusing to them, all this white-collar stuff. You know, unions, cement contracts, constructions. I don't even understand it.
It's when guys start thinking of themselves, that's when this thing of ours will be destroyed. They're greedy from drugs.
So can you blame them?
Yes, I can blame them. Because it's better to make 200 million with no risk than 500 million with the feds up my ass. Can't you see that? Doesn't anybody see that? Am I the only one? And don't tell me about tough guys, Neil. Because as soon as these tough guys today get caught and they're facing hard time, they seem better than Pavarotti.
Because Carlo Gambino wanted Paul in an administrative position in the family, there are several accounts that Carlo did not want Paul to be involved on the street level, to not be involved in the violent aspects of the family business.
Carlo Gambino wanted his cousin not to be involved in the dirty work that, the other guys could do for us.
This would suggest that keeping Paul's hands clean was a deliberate part of Gambino's grand design. Therefore, everyone's distaste of Paul's avoidance from the nitty-gritty aspects within the family is misdirected. Logic would then place the blame towards Carlo Gambino, who sanctioned all of Paul's methods. Following this pattern, it could be assumed that even if Paul wanted to get his hands dirty, Carlo would not allow it. Therefore, the rejection of Paul is an insult to Carlo's intelligence. And the killing of Paul Castellano was not only disgraceful, but disloyal to the very memory and legacy of Carlo Gambino.
Carlo was the boss. He picked his brother-in-law. Now Paul is the boss. That is it.
Furthermore, white-collar, non-violent crimes are usually granted bail, and family operations can continue with its leader still in place. This further supports the logic of having a business-oriented boss to lead a criminal empire. The final argument against Paul was his administration as boss. Again, on its surface this argument is without merit. A boss runs his family as he sees fit. In an FBI surveillance recording, underboss Neil Della Croce is quoted saying,
That's why I said to you before, you don't understand what an usher. An usher means that the boss is your boss. Understand?
Evidently, Paul demanded a 15% cut of earnings instead of the usual 10%. If that was the case, then so be it.
The typical 10% of a crew's earnings wasn't enough for Paul. He wanted 15%.
If there's a $500,000 score, and he only gets $50,000, he goes crazy. How come I'm only getting 10%? He'd fly off the handle about who's running this. He didn't do anything, but he's the boss, so he should get more.
Again, in this situation, we must acknowledge and give credit to Neil Della Croce for his loyalty and duty to the family and to Paul Castellano. He not only adhered to Paul's increase in tax, he exceeded it.
The crews complained to each other, but that was about all they could do. It was no use telling their boss, Neil Della Croce, who oversaw many of the crews and was considered a hoodlum's hoodlum. Della Croce just wanted to keep the peace and keep the boss happy.
If $200,000 came in from a construction project, he would go up to the White House and give $100,000 to Big Paul, because he believed that the boss is the boss is the boss.
One of the major deciding factors that triggered the revolt against Paul was the issue surrounding the so-called Ruggiero tapes.
Then, a family crisis centered on the John Gotti crowd. On August 23, 1983, 8 Gambino soldiers, including Gotti's friend Angelo Ruggiero and Gotti's younger brother Gene, were arrested for smuggling heroin. Most of the evidence came from the FBI's tap on the Long Island home of Angelo Ruggiero, nicknamed Quack Quack because he talked so much. Paul was desperate to learn if he had been implicated on the Ruggiero tapes, so he demanded that the crew leader, Neil Della Croce, bring a copy of the wiretap evidence to him at his White House, a copy that had now been provided to the Gambino men awaiting trial. The boss wanted to hear the tapes for himself.
Paul had every right to demand the Ruggiero tapes, and as revealed, the tapes did have the evidence against Angelo Ruggiero and the other men that were implicated. And the tapes did in fact contain subversive talk against Paul Castellano and other mobsters that Angelo had issues against.
I'm going to tell you something. If you two never bother with me again the rest of my life, I ain't giving them tapes. I can't. There's good friends of mine on them tapes. Well, he's the boss. You have to do what he tells you.
The tapes in Angelo's house became a tremendous issue. It wasn't surveillance, it was audio. What he talked about was not only drugs, he talked about all the bosses in the commission, all the underbosses, Paul Castellano himself. These tapes that came out of Angelo's house and John's mouth in some of these cases, and that whole crew, affected every boss, underboss, and consigliere in the mafia.
Not only did Gotti and his crew hide behind their patron Neil Della Croce, the fact that they refused to give up the tapes is unacceptable. The Gotti crew, despite their effectiveness as earners and enforcers, they did warrant adjudication and subsequent punishment for their actions. Had Gotti not struck first, he, along with his brother Gene, and Angelo Ruggiero should have and would have been sentenced to death.
The rule was broken, yes. It calls for Gotti to die. Was the reason for breaking the rule so powerful that it was justified? We need all the John Gottis we can get, but we survive by our rules. If it was my call, he would go.
He would be within his rights. I mean, Paulie has every right to whack out your whole crew. Neil and I, that was Carlo's edict.
The justification the Gotti crew had for killing Paul Castellano was kill or be killed.
I think at that point they knew they were talking with Neil already. They knew they were in big trouble. So it was run, leave the country, leave the state, leave some run, or kill or be killed.
Kill or be killed, however, is absolutely not a valid defense because you cannot kill a boss, full stop. And yet they did. And by doing so, this upsets the natural order of things. One can argue this moment was the catalyst. This moment is when everything began to fall apart. The words of Joseph Armoni and Neil Della Croce would come back to haunt the killers of Paul Castellano and haunt the rest of La Cosa Nostra.
We need all the John Gottis we can get, but we survive by our rules.
The rules? You break the rules in this whole goddamn thing of ours. Cracks and crumbles. You never break the rules. Capiche? Capiche.
In the aftermath of Paul's assassination, some say a smarter boss would have recognized a threat and taken more precautions. However, Paul was entitled to full protection from the commission. Only a full commission can authorize a hit on a boss. The Concrete Club alliance between the Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese families already solidified a 3-vote majority within the commission. John Gotti had little to no commission support when he decided to move against Paul.
I got every right to talk this way. I was at the sit-down with Neil and Paul and Don Carlo after you clipped Gaglione. You broke a rule then. But Neil got you a pass. So then you went ahead, you broke another rule. You whacked out a boss without a commission okay.
Excuse me. I'm supposed to get a commission okay? Well, my family's being blooded that... Hey, fuck Paul. He deserved it.
That's got nothing to do with it. The rules are for everybody.
I brought you into this family. I made you what you are. You're strong and you're smart, but don't ever believe that you are bigger than anything.
I don't think I'm bigger than a...
Don't interrupt me. I know what you're thinking. But John, you cannot whack out a boss. Only the full commission can make that call. I love you like a son. But don't ever put me in a spot. And don't ever force my hand.
The only problem, they hit another brick wall with Neil. He wouldn't approve a hit on Paul. He was straight up Cosa Nostra, you don't kill a boss.
In conclusion, whether or not you like Paul Castellano is irrelevant. Again, the boss is the boss is the boss. In our opinion, Carlo Gambino is the standard bearer for La Cosa Nostra. Consequently, it was our admiration of Carlo Gambino that prompted us to defend his choice of Paul Castellano as his successor.
You were always the thinker.
You rest, Carlo.
I got you into this thing of ours, Paulie. And now I'm gonna make it worse. I'm naming you Capo e tutti capi.
What about Neil?
It's straight. You got the brain, the vision. Neil already knows. Listen, Paulie, I'm putting a curse on you, not no blessing. Now you'll learn what it is to be alone.
This video can very well be an argument in defense of Carlo Gambino more than Paul Castellano. We subscribe to the idea of Carlo Gambino's infallibility, which ultimately led us towards our defense and opinions of Paul Castellano. Carlo Gambino was right to pick Paul Castellano, and Paul Castellano had the right to run the Gambino family as he saw fit. And had he done so, he would have ushered La Cosa Nostra into a new era, an era of unimaginable wealth, power, and influence in both the underworld and the corporate world. But in the end, it was the street guys, the so-called real gangsters, the tough guys. They wanted to keep La Cosa Nostra in the streets. And now, the street is all they have left.
So you have the rise of this enormous criminal organization. Then it reaches its apogee in the reign of Carlo Gambino and the reign of Paul Castellano, and then crashes, is destroyed by the reign of John Gotti. I think a final thought may be a quote from Big Paul Castellano. This life of ours, this is a wonderful life. If you can get through life like this and get away with it, hey, that's great. But it's very unpredictable. There are so many ways you can screw it up. They screwed up in the end.